Hey YouTube, it's me, Derek DC Phillips, bringing you all things frightful, and I have a question for you. Have you ever wondered what would happen if Jack Torrance from The Shining faced off against Freddy Krueger? No? Well, if you were wondering, you can pretty much find out the answer if you pick up a copy of Stephen King's The Dark Half. Now, it should come as no surprise that someone who runs a YouTube channel dedicated to all things frightful, an author of creepy things, admires Stephen King, and I always find my way back to his books. You know, I can take a break. He has such a great back catalog that I can pretty much jump back in and say, where were we? And pick up something amazing that I never knew existed. And that's kind of what happened with The Dark Half. This is one of those books that I had seen on the shelf at used bookstores. I had sort of read about online, but it's one that I had never gotten into for some reason. And it's one of those that also online is called out as one of Stephen King's most underrated books ever. People say it is almost a crime how underrated this book is, and then other people say it's fairly middle of the road. Nobody online, you're not going to find any reviews down the Reddit rabbit hole or anywhere else where people just say this book is awful, I don't know what he was thinking. At bare minimum, people rank this as one of his perfectly serviceable books. So if you find yourself diving down that rabbit Reddit hole or looking around at reviews on Google, Goodreads, wherever, pretty much everyone comes to that consensus that it's a pretty good book. You know, I think people sometimes, knowing that Stephen King is the author, are going to judge a bit more harshly. And I do think that this book perhaps is not as notable, or it does not get as much attention as some of his others, because Stephen King came off of a stretch of classics right before he wrote this one and a couple of others. So you gotta think, this book, he started writing in 1987, just to give you a bit of background, and it was published in 1989. A great year, if I do say so myself. Now, this book is certainly a product of its time. I will give you that much. He had already written Carrie, Salem's Lot, It. I mean, those are all hard to top, right? Those are top tier of the genre, period. And then when you look at Stephen King's work, it's hard to follow up, but somehow over the decades, he has managed to put out books that really resonate with people. One thing that I think is really cool about Stephen King is that when he does master one type of book or one subgenre, he goes and tackles something else like crime, and he still gives you something really incredible, really impressive, but it's in a different lane, so you're not exactly comparing it to those early classics anymore. So I think the most entertaining thing about The Dark Half for me is that it's almost autobiographical in some aspects, because Stephen King had pretty much just been outed for being Richard Bachman. If you're watching this video, you probably already know Stephen King wrote books under the name Richard Bachman. Thinner is one that comes to mind. I'm looking at it on my shelf over here right now. And he almost wanted to see if he could replicate the success that he had under his own name, but again, completely of his own merit, without that name recognition. And I believe there was also a contractual obligation. I'm not entirely sure. And when that came out, I think he wanted to have a little fun with the idea of a pen name almost taking over the identity of the real person. You know, where does one stop and where does one start? In The Dark Half, we're introduced to Thad Beaumont. I'm gonna say Thad. I'm pretty sure it's short for Thaddeus. I don't think it's Tad. Right? Okay, so anyway, Mr. Beaumont is a prolific author, but he's prolific under the name George Stark. That's his pen name. And I won't give you really any spoilers in this video. I don't like that. I mean, I know it's a 30-plus-year-old book, but It may be new to you like it was new to me. Mr. Beaumont, when he was born, the first few chapters start out talking about his childhood. So the beginning of the book, we're actually introduced to Thaddeus as a child. And in the first chapter, again, not a spoiler, in the first chapter we learned that he was a twin who consumed the other twin who did not make it in the womb. And so as he's growing up, he has these headaches. His parents are told that it's a brain tumor, but in reality, the remnants of this twin were removed. I'll pause right there for a second. I actually wish that this had gone a bit deeper into the rest of the book, because we sort of just jump from this childhood situation of the twin being removed, and then we jump into adulthood where Thaddeus is an author. He's not super famous in his own right, but under the name George Stark he is. And so I wish we got a little bit more there. Who am I? Who am I? Seriously, I'm just doing this video for fun. Who am I? I'm not critiquing the king, but as a fan, I'm just saying, you know, some of his other books, I think what really works well about those is that we get a deeper dive into that backstory, and here we kind of jump right into adulthood. Another non-spoiler is that the pen name has a burial ceremony that is featured in People magazine because Thaddeus is outed as this other artist. His pen name is outed, and the burial is not permanent, and George Stark refuses to stay buried for long. The villain in the George Stark, the pen names books, is Alexis Machine. And I again, this is where toward the middle of the book, there's a lot of overlap. Essentially, George Stark and Alexis Machine are one and the same, but I think, you know, maybe Stephen King could have played with it a little bit there and kept us guessing or fleshed that out a bit. Who am I to judge Stephen King? No one. Now, having said that, I have read interviews with Stephen King where he talks about Tommyknockers, which was written shortly before The Dark Half, and Stephen King himself acknowledges that the middle of that book is fairly bloated because certain substances were at play, and I kind of wonder if that is a factor here. I wonder if he was, you know, reflecting on his own experiences, his dark side, his dark half. That's obviously. So I mentioned that this is a product of its time. It is super 80s. I almost felt like it's Stephen King's version of a slasher movie, honestly. Not all the way through, but especially when we're introduced to the villain of the pen names books, Alexis Machine, and the pen name George Stark. There is some really gruesome, grisly violence in there. Again, I kind of imagined Freddy Krueger in my head because that's sort of the feel you get, because obviously he's not 100% flesh and blood. There's something supernatural at play. There's an element of that there. So it's a product of its time. Interesting experiment for Stephen King, and I think the violence was also played up because he was tapping into kind of the alter ego or the pen names, the twins, penchant for violent novels, pulpy crime novels, hard-boiled crime. So you get a bit of that in there. I will say that in my opinion, the villain of George Stark / Alexis Machine does go the way of Freddy Krueger here and there by leaning a bit too hard into the jokey, little bit corny territory. I didn't really get in certain sections, especially the sections that are told from the point of view of George Stark. I didn't really know 100% if Mr. King wanted us to read it as 100% straight and serious or a bit of comedy. There was definitely some dark comedy rolled in there, and we get some of Mr. King's classic dialogue that goes along with that dark comedy territory. I still can't get with happy crappy. There are a few of those phrases that pop up throughout Stephen King's works that I'm like, really? I think this is something like an inside joke in his head that sometimes we as the reader are just like, okay, this keeps popping up, but do people say that? The villain also has a Mississippi accent that kind of comes and goes, so we get a lot of hoss in there. Again, who am I? Who am I? I'm making a video for fun about this book that Stephen King wrote. May not have even thought about twice since. I felt that we did get a pretty solid ending here. I think I would have liked to have leaned in a bit more into the supernatural. That the explanations behind that come in a bit late. I would have loved to hear more about it. Chief Alan Pangborn makes an appearance, I guess is the main character in Needful Things as well. So lots of Castle Rock mythology thrown in here and woven throughout. I thought that was really, really nice. The original multiverse, if you will. Definitely for some foreshadowing of future works. I love how Stephen King has this way of sort of mirroring older works in his newer ones, and I would think that's intentional, or maybe he thinks to himself, what would happen if I had altered this element a bit. I definitely get the outsider vibes when I'm reading The Dark Half, because it's one of those where it starts out one way, fairly straightforward, and then something really unexpected comes up and you're like, oh, okay, I see where he's going with that now, but it was totally unexpected. Definitely that idea of duality, that darkness, with the violence, the grotesque violence, there are some dark chapters along the way. I was also sort of reminded of Revival. That's another one. I think Revival and The Dark Half for me are about neck and neck in terms of Stephen King's catalog. Because Revival, I loved the childhood stuff. I felt like we really went in depth there, which was an integral part of the story. I was so pulled in. By the end of that one, again, the supernatural or I won't ruin it, but that element of the beyond was kind of like, oh, okay. All right, a little bit of surprise. But I do feel like those two are kind of neck and neck in terms of books, of Stephen King's books that don't get as much attention, but they are perfectly serviceable. They're a fun read. They've got some really good elements going for them. Also cannot believe that the movie version of this book does not get more attention or talked about more than it does. Maybe it's just me. I don't know. I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. Were you familiar with The Dark Half, the book or the movie? Because when I started digging in, I thought, you know, there are a lot of Stephen King properties that get turned into made-for-TV movies, which I love, or, you know, he is not happy with the finished product. And so I thought maybe that was the case here, but it's really not. The movie was written and directed by George Romero. So I've added it to my watch list. As of this recording, I have not watched it, but I plan to. There's even an all-star cast. Julie Harris of The Haunting, Michael Rooker, who we all know from The Walking Dead and so many other horror properties. So it looks really great. I watched a trailer before I recorded this, and I will say I think having George Romero there, the dark humor comes through at the forefront. It feels very much like an extended Tales from the Dark Side episode, which I'm really excited about. So I would love to know down in the comments, is this book underrated in your opinion? Did you like it? Do you plan to read it? What is Stephen King's most underrated work in your mind? What is Stephen King's most overrated work? Why limit ourselves? Go down to the comments and let's keep this conversation going.